welcome you to the first in our series this year, Books That Shaped America. For those of you who have been with us, or perhaps not have been with us for the past couple of years, this list of books came from the Library of Congress. A group of the curators there went through the library's collection and said, which are the books that really have shaped discussions in America? And it's shaped discussions, shaped conversations, shaped part of American life, but were not necessarily the best books, the award-winning books, the Nobel Prize-winning books of any kind, but they shaped conversations. So books like Dr. Spock, To Kill a Mockingbird, The Joy of Cooking are books that are in this list. And later this year, we're going to be doing a couple of the children's books. But today, we're going to do A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And I was telling some of my colleagues here that I'm a book listener these days because I have at least an hour's commute each way to work. And so that means 2 CDs a day that I get to listen to these. And I'm on the last CD. So I actually don't know how this book ends. I never read it as a teenager. But I may find that out today.
We'll find out. We'll find out.
To lead us through our discussion today, I am delighted to introduce to you Professor Alan Kraut, who is a professor of history at American University in Washington, D.C. And we are really delighted when people step a little bit away from their strict discipline to talk about literature that reflects the discipline. And we've had this with several faculty members. We've had law professors talking about novels. And it's been a very cool part of having this experience on the campus. In addition to being a professor of history, he's also affiliate faculty at our School of International Service. He received his BA from Hunter College of the City University of New York, his master's and his PhD from Cornell University. He also holds a faculty appointment at the Uniformed University of the Health Sciences, the Armed Services Medical School, and he is a non-resident fellow of Migration Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. He's a scholar and a specialist in U.S. immigration and ethnic history and the history of medicine and public health in the United States. He is the author or the editor of 9 books and over 100 articles and book reviews. His books on immigration include The Huddled Masses, The Immigrant in American Society, American Refugee Policy and European Jewry, and Silent Travelers, Germs, Genes, and the Immigrant Menace. A lot of that is reflected in this book that we are talking about today. And I heard phrases in this book that I have not heard since I was a child. Phrases that my grandmother used every day in conversation that I haven't heard in the past 20 years. So I'm delighted that you recommended this book as the one you wanted to do. And please come to the podium.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with you this afternoon and to be talking about A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. I must say, before I sort of open up and talk about some of the issues of the book and do a brief summary, I had the opportunity to read this book many, many times because it was on my parents' bookshelf in the tenement apartment that I grew up in the South Bronx. And I asked my father one day, what's that book about? And he said, oh, it's about a little girl growing up in Brooklyn. Well, that's all a little boy growing up in the Bronx had to hear. I wasn't reading that book. I read Chip Hilton's, sports hero, Chip Hilton halfback, but not this book. In fact, as time went on, it really wasn't until graduate school and beyond that I actually engaged with A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. One couldn't pick, I think, a more timely book than this one, because we're at a moment when migration is on everybody's lips. We open up the newspapers in the morning and we see the refugees pouring out of Syria and trying to wend their way into Western Europe, and some of them maybe to the United States as well. We hear presidential candidates making all kinds of remarks, some of them absolutely scandalous, about migrants. And then we hear the compassion of Pope Francis last week with respect to migrants and how they're to be treated by us. For American historians, of course, migration has been an integral part of the American narrative. The great Oscar Handlin at Harvard in 1951 when he published the book he's best known for, The Uprooted, wrote, "Once I thought to write a history of the immigrants in America, then I discovered that the immigrants were American history," end quote. It was my privilege to know Oscar Handlin in the years before he passed away, and I know he still always felt that. There is some disagreement with that today. There are other ways in which America was formed: annexation, conquest, enslavement. But migration remains a very, very important part of the American story. And so it's important to take a look at this, but also it's important to take a look at what happens after immigration. What comes next? What comes next is sometimes called assimilation or incorporation or integration. There are a lot of names for what happens after folks move from one place to another. And the subject of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn is about one family and their adjustment to life in America. They are not immigrants themselves. They are the children, or in one case, the grandchild of immigrants. But nevertheless, the core of the story is about people whose families have been on the move and are now engaging with American society. Climbing the ladder is the metaphor that's often used. This book was published in 1943, right in the middle of the Second World War. The scene for the novel is Brooklyn, New York. If you wanted to talk about immigrants and you wanted to talk about ethnicity and you wanted to talk about class, you couldn't pick a better place than Brooklyn, New York in the 1940s. I say that as a Bronx boy born in the 1940s. But nevertheless, Brooklyn was the place. And those of you who watch old World War II movies will see very often in the platoon that is being covered, there's somebody from Brooklyn. There's an Italian, there's a Jew, there's an Irishman. Because Brooklyn represented what many Americans like to think of as the American melting pot. Plenty of tensions, to be sure. It wasn't a smooth melt, but nevertheless, Brooklyn was the place. It was also one of the older parts of New York. You know, what we call New York City today, the five boroughs, was only formed in 1898. This book opens in 1912. And so Greater New York had not existed for very long. And so folks who lived in Brooklyn, and this was true even when I was a child, often talked about going into the city. Let's go into the city, by which they meant Manhattan or any of the other five boroughs. But Brooklyn had been a separate city, its own city, until 1898. The action in the book takes place between roughly 1900 and 1918. We pick it up in 1912, and there are flashbacks. And it's about the Nolan family. It's about the son of Irish immigrants, Johnny Nolan, and his wife, the former Katie Romilly, who's of German heritage, and their children, Francie, who is the main protagonist of the book, and her younger brother, Neely. And included in this are two sisters, two of Katie's sisters, Sissy and Evie. But it is the story of this Nolan family that Betty Smith focuses on in the novel. They are very poor. It's a young couple, Katie and Johnny. He doesn't really have a trade. He becomes a janitor, a maintenance person. He is ultimately a singing waiter, a position that he loves very, very much, but they don't make a great deal of money. When the novel opens, the couple together are doing maintenance work in a public school, but when Katie is born, that ends. She's born in 1900, and so we pick it up when she is 12 years old. The family. But what about the tree? Well, the tree appears on the page 2 of the novel. Katie looks out the tenement window and she looks at this tree. One tree in Francie's yard was neither a pine nor a hemlock. It had pointed leaves which grew along green switches which radiated from the bough and made a tree which looked like a lot of opened green umbrellas. Some people called it the tree of heaven. No matter where its seeds fell, it made a tree which struggled to reach the sky. It grew in boarded up lots and out of neglected rubbish heaps, and it was the only tree that grew out of cement. It grew lushly, but only in the tenement districts. End quote. What a beautiful description, and what an opening metaphor for how youngsters grow up in that kind of urban poverty and in that kind of tenement district. And so we see Katie and her parents as she's growing up, and Katie works until Francie is born, and then she stays home to take care of Francie and Neely. We watch as they navigate through the poverty that is their existence in this period. One of the things that's very striking is the discussion of supper. Let me see if I can find supper. Just had it. Saturday supper was a red-letter meal. The Nolans had fried meat. A loaf of stale bread was made into pulp with hot water and mixed with a dime's worth of chopped meat into which an onion had been cleavered. Salt and a penny's worth of minced parsley were added for flavor. This was made up into little balls, fried and served with hot ketchup. These meatballs had a name, frikadellen, which was a great joke with Francie and Neely. They lived mostly on these things, made from stale bread and condensed milk and coffee, onions, potatoes, and always the penny's worth of something bought at the last minute, added for fillip. Once in a while they had a banana, but Francie always longed for oranges and pineapple, and especially tangerines, which she got only at Christmas. Again and again throughout this first part of the novel, we see what they're eating, where they're playing, what they're wearing, and how difficult life can be. Especially moving are the moments when we see how little regard many folks have for the poor, for those who have less than they do. I always find moving the scene about a Christmas tree. The children want a Christmas tree very, very badly. And there's a way that you can get one, but you have to make a sacrifice in order to do that. The paragraph begins, "There was a cruel custom in the neighborhood. It was about the trees still unsold when midnight of Christmas Eve approached. There was a saying that if you waited until then, you wouldn't have to buy a tree, that they'd chuck 'em at you," which was literally true. At midnight on the eve of our dear Savior's birth, the kids gathered where there were unsold trees. The man threw each tree in turn, starting with the biggest. Kids volunteered to stand up against the throwing. If a boy didn't fall down under the impact, the tree was his. If he fell, he forfeited his chance at winning a tree. Only the roughest boys and some of the young men elected to be hit by the big trees. The others waited shrewdly until a tree came up that they could stand against. The little kids waited for the tiny foot-high trees and shrieked in delight when they won one. On this occasion, they win one, and they have a tree for Christmas. Think about that. Having somebody throw the leftovers at you as a way of bringing a little happiness into your home and as a way of surviving. The novel proceeds with Katie very, very conscious of all she's experiencing, talking about her existence, and not in an angry or bitter way. One of the interesting things about the novel is she is enveloped by love. The love of her parents, the love of her brother, the love of her aunts, and she sees her experience as a very rich one that she wants to tell others about. After all, she may be poor, but she's not angry and bitter about it. She sees poverty as something like other things in life that you have to navigate around. And she has learned the art of urban navigation very, very well. Sadly, there are things that she comes in contact with that she can't navigate around. One of them is sexual molestation, and the book has a scene in which her mother actually runs and gets a gun that the father had purchased to protect his family and shoots a sexual molester as he's approaching Katie. And all the while, there is the struggle of the father to stay sober, to work, to support his family. One of the really moving parts of this book is what happens when Katie's father dies. Katie's father had been, as I said before, a singing waiter, but he drank habitually, and eventually the complications of what sounds like cirrhosis of the liver to me and pneumonia as the immediate cause kill him. And the family is left without a breadwinner. But they have their pride, and pride is a very important part of this family's existence. And there is a discussion about the death certificate that I found very moving also. I've seen this firsthand about death certificates and the truths that they sometimes tell. Those of you who remember Tony Kushner's play Angels in America remembers the character of Roy Cohn, the politician, and when he's diagnosed and he says to his doctor, men of distinction don't get this disease. Men who are respected, men of power don't get this disease. They get kidney cancer. And the discussion here is a little bit like that. They want to put on the death certificate that Johnny Nolan has died of alcoholism, pneumonia complicated by alcoholism. And Katie says to the doctor, look, I got two nice children. They're going to grow up to amount to something. It isn't their fault that their father, that he died from what you said. It would mean a lot to me if I could tell them that their father died of pneumonia alone. And here, the Catholic priest who is with her intervenes. Catholicism is very important in the life of this family. And the priest took it in hand. He says, you can do it, doctor, without hurt to yourself and with benefit to others. Don't be kicking around of a poor lad that's dead and gone. Write down pneumonia, which is no lie. And this lady will be remembering you in her prayers for a long time to come. Besides, it's no skin off your teeth, end quote. And so the family retains its pride even in this terrible, terrible moment. After Johnny Nolan's passing, of course, the family is now really on its own. I mean, there's Katie, who is taking work, cleaning work, is a superintendent in building. The kids have part-time jobs, but it is a struggle. It is really a struggle to make ends meet. Finally, the decision is made that Neely will go to high school and Katie will not. And it's a very, very tough decision because Katie has already gotten a thirst for education. And not only has she gotten a thirst for education, but she's gotten a thirst for writing. There's an episode that occurs in school when there's an extra apple pie, pumpkin pie, and the teacher doesn't quite know how to handle one pie and all the kids in the group, in the class. And so Katie volunteers to give the pie to a poor family, as if hers isn't poor enough. And so she gets the pie, but of course she's tempted. She's never had a pumpkin pie before, and so she eats it. And she lies about it. And the teacher sort of catches her in the lie and then explains that, one of the things about writing is that you can kind of restructure reality. Gently, teacher explained the difference between a lie and a story. A lie was something you told because you were mean or a coward. A story was something you made up out of something that might have happened. Only you didn't tell it like it was. You told it like you thought it should have been. The story is something you tell as reality should have been. It's just wonderful. And so Katie takes a job. She takes a job for a newspaper clipping service. And so now she's in a situation where she's reading newspapers every day. And she's really improving. She tries summer school at one of the local colleges, though she doesn't have a high school diploma. And for summer school, she's taken on, personally, I think she's at my alma mater, Hunter College. It sounded an awful lot like Hunter. But in any case, she tries that, but it's not a permanent solution for her. And the family continues to go along and to struggle, but Francie is bringing in money now, and so things are a little bit better. It's clear that all the hopes are on Neely, and that was very typical of immigrant families like that. The hope was always on the son. Whether it was the eldest son or the youngest son, it was usually the son rather than the daughter that got the first money to go to college in these days. And that is certainly part of her experience. But while she's at summer school, at college, she meets a young man named Ben Blake, and they become very, very fond of each other. Ben vanishes from her life, but nevertheless, she always remembers him and his kindness to her. And she continues along, and then through somebody in her workplace, she meets another boy, Lee Reiner. And he is going off to war. He's in the army. It's World War I. And Lee is having his last fling in town, and he's kind of hoping that it's going to be with Francie. She rejects his sexual advances, and Lee leaves. And a short while later, she gets a letter from someone in Pennsylvania, another woman, who identifies herself as Mrs. Reiner. Because in fact he's gone off and gotten married to someone else, to an old girlfriend, before he's shipped out. Francie is shattered, absolutely shattered by this. She thinks she'll never believe in love again, and she's very disillusioned. But it's one of the lessons in life, and this is a book about becoming, an act of growing up, and that's part of it too. The novel begins to come to a conclusion as we enter this World War I period, and there's a bit more prosperity in the United States, you can tell, from the amount of money that the family can bring in. And moreover, Katie has a suitor. The suitor is a policeman, a sergeant named McShane. He had a wife. Wife was very sick, and she finally died. And then Sergeant McShane, who has been aware of the family for a long time, presents himself to Katie, and in a very moving passage says, "Would you mind if we'd be keeping company?" And she says, yes, she would keep company with him. And he has very wisely made a few real estate investments. And so he's got some money, and he promises to take good care of the family, good care of the children, and most of all, is going to send Francie off to college. And at the conclusion of the novel, at the very, very end of the novel, Francie is going off to the University of Michigan. Even though she has not completed high school, the implication is that she's going to be able to get into her college classes. And so the last thing she does as she's leaving Brooklyn, as the family is moving out of its apartment and they're moving on, is she looks to the tree. Let's see if I can find that passage. And the tree is, of course, still there. She looked down into the yard. The tree whose leaf umbrellas had curled around, under, and over her fire escape had been cut down because the housewives complained that wash-on-the-lines got entangled in its branches. The landlord had sent 2 men and they had chopped it down, but the tree hadn't died. It hadn't died. A new tree had grown from the stump, and its trunk had grown along the ground until it reached a place where there were no wash lines above it. Then it had started to grow toward the sky again. Annie, the fir tree that the Nolans had cherished with waterings and manurings, had long since sickened and died. But this tree in the yard, this tree that men chopped down, this tree that they built a bonfire around trying to burn up its stump, this tree lived. It lived, and nothing could destroy it. The perfect way for the novel to end in many ways. Betty Smith, who wrote this novel in 1943, made it really in many ways autobiographical. She herself, like Katie, like the mom, was the daughter of German immigrants. She grew up in Brooklyn, knew Brooklyn well. She married somebody in Brooklyn, a law student, and they moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan, so he could pursue a law degree. She had 2 little girls and didn't complete college herself until the 2 little girls were grown. In 1938, her husband passed, and she parted ways, and she moved to Chapel Hill, North Carolina. She remarried, in fact, the same year that her book came out. And later she teamed up with Broadway producer George Abbott and put on a musical based on the book, musical adaptation. She continued to write. Most of her other novels were not well known. Only one got some traction, Joy in the Morning, which was published in 1963. She died in 1972. She was 75 years old. 2 of her novels, Joy in the Morning, but also this book, Tree Grows in Brooklyn, were made into movies, and the movie was very, very successful. Those of you who, as I am, are addicts of TCM will see this movie from time to time. It's a regular on TCM. It was directed by the very brilliant Elia Kazan. It starred James Dunn, Joan Blondell, Dorothy McGuire, all stars of this period in the early 60s when this movie came out. And it really, in some ways retained the popularity of the book. People saw the movie and they said, well, now I'll go read the book. And so it helped a lot. Now, how do I come to this book? Although these many years after walking past it for decades on my parents' bookshelf, as an American historian who specializes in immigration, it is most certainly a 2nd and 3rd generation immigrant tale. It is about one of the most important immigrations in American history. That of Western Europeans to the United States began in the 1840s. The Great Hunger, or the Potato Famine of 1846, was a spike in immigration from Ireland. But in the period just between 1840 and 1860, 4.5 million immigrants came mostly from Ireland and Germany. By the time Johnny and Katie meet, intermarriage has already begun between and among these groups. It's not unusual to have an Irishman and a German woman marrying. After all, in this case, they are both Catholics, so religion is not an issue, as it would have been if they were dating a Jew, for example, or a Protestant. So that part isn't there. But it's a very, very important part of the American story, because later in the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th, there would be a wave of 23.5 million more immigrants, mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe, a period when the Italians dominate, the Eastern European Jews, the Russians, the Poles. But what people often forget is that earlier migration, though it slowed, never petered out. There continued to be Irish immigrants and German immigrants coming to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. And one of the really interesting parts about this migration is that among the Irish, women predominate. That almost never happened in the 19th and early 20th century. The typical pattern of migration was you sent the young men got jobs, they sent for their wives if they were married and for the rest of the family. But what we see happening because of the politics of life in Ireland, the land tenure system, the difficulties of women who marry very, very late, is that women are seeking opportunity in America, and there is greater opportunity for these women in America than there are actually for the males. What are those opportunities? Domestic labor. Domestic labor is very, very cultural. Not every group will permit its women to do domestic labor, but the Irish and the Germans both permitted it. And so a good job would be to find a position in the home of a middle or upper middle class family where you would find shelter and food and a salary and access to all of the things you needed. The only part of the deal was you were expected not to marry, but to take care of the family and especially the children of the family. But it is a period when Irish women play a very, very important role in American society and culture. In fact, putting on my other hat now as a historian of medicine, one of the real ways that Catholic hospitals get their support during this period are from subscriptions that were purchased by single Irish women who pay, maybe 25 cents a week. And what they're buying is basically health care. When they get sick, the hospital has to take them in. They are buying a respectable place to be sick and ultimately to die. And so they are paying these subscription fees, and the hospitals are able to survive because they are getting income from people who ultimately will be patients in those hospitals. Moreover, they enter the realm of popular culture, right? Bridget the Maid, or those of you who may have read to your children, as I did to my daughter, Amelia Bedelia, the silly Irish maid. She's as much of a stereotype, as a cultural stereotype, as the typical Irish cop on the beat. The point is that this was seen as a positive sort of experience. One came, one struggled, one found opportunity, one overcame obstacles, and one succeeded. The American success story. Of course, not for everyone. Not everybody climbed the ladder. Not everybody ultimately got to go to the University of Michigan. But it happened often enough so that the notion of upward mobility for those who came is very, very important. It's also a class story. It's about class in America and the pain of class. We focus a great deal in our society on race, ethnicity, gender these days, but the hardest thing for our scholars, including historians, to tackle is the issue of class in America. Partly because it's so fluid, partly because the absence of rigid class lines make it sometimes very hard to study and to get your arms around as a topic. We haven't treated it as fully and as carefully as we really need to do. Now, this topic of class brings me to what I wanted to say about the reception of the book. The book sold very, very well, almost immediately. It sold 300,000 copies in a few months after it was published. And this is in the middle of World War II, when a lot of people are away. It got a rave review in the New York Times from the Times reviewer, Orville Prescott. And this is what he says. Betty Smith's A Tree Grows in Brooklyn is the best first novel I have seen in many a moon. It is also the best first novel of any kind I have read in 1943. Here is a book worth getting excited about and an author worth cheering. The war may preoccupy many of our top-ranked novelists so that the average level of current fiction in recent months has been depressing indeed. But if many more new writers of Miss Smith's caliber turn up, the immediate future of the American novel is safe, end quote. And Prescott's celebration of the book is echoed in a lot of other reviews, save one. And that one is perhaps the most interesting and raises questions that we can discuss here. It is a review that was written by Diana Trilling in The Nation. Diana Trilling, whose maiden name was Rubin, Diana Rubin, who married Lionel Trilling, who taught for many, many years at City College at Columbia University, rather, in New York, was part of a group of sort of New York intellectuals. Irving Howe, Irving Kristol. They used to say that the little niche in City College where they sat and talked to one another went from Irving to Irving. And she was part of that group, Columbia, City College, New York University. They met in each other's homes. They wrote reviews. They criticized each other's essays. They could be pretty vicious at times as well. And this is what Diana Trilling says in 1943. In Miss Smith's picture of American poverty, there is neither ugliness nor rebellion, only sentiment. She objected to, quote, a sweet cooperativeness. National unity reflects itself in family unity, and fiction arms us with the illusion of domestic security against the insecurity of the world, end quote. Clearly, what Diana Trilling would have liked to hear are some words of class anger, class resentment, some passion against the forces that were keeping Francie and her family in those tenements. But it's not there. And of course, that leaves us with the question of, should it have been? Is this an overly sweet portrayal of a little girl's memory of her childhood? And you know, childhood memories are so often happy memories, not always. Does it not ring of the greater truth of class oppression in the United States? Certainly a lot of the people that Diana Trilling hung with in the 1930s and 1940s thought there should have been something about who had the wealth in America and who didn't. And that's not part of the novel. But it leaves us with the question, especially in an age of angry young intellectuals who are angry about the racial situation, angry about American policies in a variety of ways. Should Betty Smith have echoed a kind of indignation and class anger that simply isn't in the book? Or is she writing a book that she intended to be optimistic because that, in fact, was the way she saw her American experience? It didn't matter who was oppressing you. It's what you did with that oppression in the face of that oppression that's what's important. So I leave you with that question. Thank you very much. Questions from you, comments? Stan. Stan, I couldn't quite understand. Do you want to write it down for me? Yeah. Write down the question, and then I'll...
While he's writing, I'll ask a question. The criticism of Trilling, were there other examples of fiction from that time period that reflected what Trilling was criticizing Smith for?
Yes. One of the most popular novelists of the era is a guy named James Farrell, who wrote about the underside of life, the Irish crime and gangsters and poverty, but with a chip, with an edge. And that's what Trilling is concerned about, is there's no edge here from her perspective. It's all sentiment. and that upsets her. She wants to hear what she feels is probably the righteous anger of those who have been left behind.
This is a little bit on the margin, but because of your health medicine background, Stephen Vincent Benet's brother published a very helpful literary encyclopedia, and I looked this book up, and it mentions the portrayal of a likable drunkard father. And I wonder whether you have a handle on the portrayal of alcoholics in American fiction, which leads up into the drinking in Prohibition, the repeal of Prohibition, and to the situation we have now in colleges and in social settings, of people who drink too much.
Yeah. Well, I think obviously there's been an enormous transition. If you go to the earliest periods of American fiction in the 19th century, of popular fiction, the person who is the drunk is looked upon someone with severe moral failings. They may do things that are amusing, but it's regarded as a moral flaw. And that tension, I think, really continues into the 20th century, and we don't see it, we don't medicalize it really until we begin to do it in the middle of the 20th century, where there's a sense that these are people who are doing something that they can't help doing, and that it's terribly damaging not only to the people around them, but to them personally, and they don't necessarily have the ability to simply suck it up and not take a drink. And now, of course, the novels that are produced, the fiction, the studies and so on, portray alcoholism as a condition. And in point of fact, one of the things we know from the genetic research that's been done is that certain ethnic groups have a greater tendency than others to have the gene that can cause alcoholism, the craving of alcohol. Native Americans, for example, suffer from that. The Irish certainly suffer from that. When I was in Ireland in 1975 doing research on the Daniel O'Connell papers. I was doing Irish abolitionism in that period. And I would go to taverns in the evening, and they would, take a drink and call it, the curse of the race. That's what, taking a swig or two is the curse of the race. And they were righter than they knew. It, in fact, is the curse of the race. Genetically, it's the curse of the race. Let me see if I can respond to this thing. She was writing directly this post-Roosevelt New Deal that did create a certain fairness in our system that fortunately has deteriorated over the last 30 or 40 years. Yeah, that's true. And one of the interesting things about the novel, I'm glad you pointed that out, is that while she mentions politics in passing, she mentions the presence of Tammany bosses in New York. But she doesn't talk about the New Deal at all. And in part because the New Deal seems not to have touched her life in any way that she's aware of. Johnny could certainly, have turned to the New Deal and gotten some help. The family could have gotten some kind of food support, perhaps, from the New Deal. It's completely absent from the novel, completely.
So, when I grew up, we still did some of the traditions that you read in this book.
Mm-hmm.
On New Year's Eve, at the strike of midnight, it was the going out onto the front porch and singing Auld Lang Syne. It was the banging of pots and pans. And my mother kept a set specifically for that purpose so that we wouldn't ruin all the others. These are your New Year's ones. And I think they had been hers as a kid. Did this tradition continue in New York, where you grew up?
It was certainly part of that. One of the places where you see it is those of you who've ever seen the Woody Allen movie Radio Days. Radio Days does a very good job in capturing that subculture. By the time I came along, you certainly had parties on New Year's Eve, but you didn't have that kind of ritual banging of pots and pans, as I recall. Yeah. I think there's a lot that I certainly resonated with it. As I said, having grown up in a tenement myself, and my father was a factory worker, so I could, and I worked in a factory myself as a young man. I resonated with a lot of the, sort of the working class attitudes that come to the surface in this, and there's a lot of it. These are really blue collar folks, and so are my folks.
I think the other thing I keep seeing in this book is the strength of the women.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that you never hear Johnny worrying about money in particular, whining that it's not there, but not putting the pieces together and figuring out the pennies and building the little bank out of the tin can that's in the floor. That was the job of the mom, probably in every one of those families, but it's particularly portrayed in the way that Kitty always thinks her way through how are we going to get enough pennies to make this happen.
Yeah.
Teaches her daughter how to bargain for the lesser vegetable that's going to go into the stew anyhow.
Right, because it's the and that's well put, because it's the mom who has to put the food on the table,
Yeah.
and if the kids are hungry, they come to the mom and say, we're hungry. Dads don't often have to hear that. They're away, they are outside when they come home. Johnny's role when he comes home is to sort of be the family entertainer. He's handsome. His daughter idealizes him. It's really pretty good. And fathers often get this. You come home at the end of the day and you're the playmate. Mom has been the disciplinarian during the day, and you get to have all the fun with the kid. You roll around on the floor until it's bedtime. Sure. So I think some of that is universal, and some of it is just Johnny's Irish charm. Other questions?
One of the things that I remember seeming to understand about this book as I first heard about it was that it was a book targeted for young adults. And I wonder if that was in Smith's mind at all, or is that just the way it has flowed into the reading by young Americans?
I think it's flowed into that. If you go back and read Orville Prescott's review in the New York Times, Prescott does not think that this is a book for kids. Maybe kids can read it, but he's talking to adults who appreciate the art of the novel. And he thinks this is a damn good one. And of course, in our own era, don't we have something similar to that with respect to Harper Lee's work, and most particularly To Kill a Mockingbird? To Kill a Mockingbird was aimed at an adult audience. It's now on every junior high, high school reading list that you can imagine. Her more recent novel, Go Set a Watchman, not likely to be, though in many ways it's a much, much more honest book. I read it over the summer and I was very, very pleased with it, because I felt that as somebody who from time to time does teach a course in Southern history and has spent a lot of time in the South doing research, it cut closer to the realities of life in the South, especially during the period that she's writing about. Atticus can still be a hero, even though he attends the White Citizens Council, as did the others of his era. Other questions?
I've often wondered about the Irish immigrants. I know you know all about this, Alex, so even if it's a little off topic, I won't hesitate to ask. Who ended up in coal fields and coal mines in Pennsylvania, Kentucky, West Virginia, those places. Did they first go through New York? Did they live there and then move on, or did they go direct?
Not all of them spent an extensive amount of time in New York. I mean, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, these are the ports. This is where the ships are coming. And sometimes it's the place where they first look for a job. The problem was, because everybody was landing in New York, the job competition was very stiff. And so they begin to move out into other areas. They find jobs on the railroads. It's no exaggeration to say that the Irish built the railroads in the East and the Midwest, and the Chinese in the far West. Would be quite accurate, actually. They end up as miners. One of my friends wrote a book about the Irish miners in the copper mines of Montana. So there's, anything that involves manual labor drew these folks to those jobs. They didn't have much education in Ireland. Many of them were basically illiterate, but they had strong backs and willing hearts, and they find opportunity.
And Ireland was a much more classed society then.
Right. They knew their place in Ireland, and they broke out of that very comfortably. And the political machine plays a very important role in that. In New York, as in Boston, the machine was controlled by the Irish. Tammany Hall was an Irish machine. Richard Croker, Honest John Kelly, and on and on and on. It's not till the very end in the 1950s that you actually get an Italian boss of Tammany Hall, a guy named Carmine DeSapio. But you haven't heard that name in a long time, I could tell.
No, but it immediately, I can see the picture.
Right, the dark glasses, the whole 9 yards, yeah. But until DeSapio came along, they were all Irish bosses, and they played ball with Roosevelt every inch of the way in the New Deal. But that moment had passed. Except for Maya Daly, who lasts 2 decades longer, the Irish political machine died. It dies in suburbia. It dies because of the New Deal. It dies for a whole variety of reasons. Better education for most young people, so that they don't believe the words of the urban boss. And yet there's a great deal of sentiment involved in thinking about what the bosses did on the ground. That's why I think Betty Smith chose to mention Tammany in the book, albeit it just in passing. The tenement where I grew up overlooked a clubhouse, a political clubhouse. And it was the Democratic power in the area by the time I was around, in my early teens, had switched from Germans and Jews and Irish to Puerto Ricans. And he was a Puerto Rican boss. And one afternoon I was sitting up in the window on the fire escape playing my radio, and he came out of the clubhouse, and he saw that the fire hydrant was on, and that there were a bunch of little kids with no clothes on dancing in the water of the fire hydrant. Well, he owned a Cadillac, pink Cadillac with a black hood, and he picked up about 6 of these kids and he tossed them in the back of his Cadillac, and he disappeared for about an hour and a half. An hour and a half later, I'm still, listening to Elvis, and he's back. Each of the kids has an outfit on and a new pair of sneakers, and each one is holding an ice cream cone in his or her hand. That was a political boss. And in the weeks before Thanksgiving, his, as I used to call them, his henchmen would come up and down the stairs of the tenement, and they would knock on your door, and they would say, are you having turkey for Thanksgiving? And if the answer was no, one appeared about a day or 2 before Thanksgiving. Nobody asked any questions. Nobody knew which truck in New Jersey it fell off of. Who the hell knows? But there were turkeys for his people in those tenements for Thanksgiving. Now, when you experience that, and you experience it firsthand, you never, ever forget it.
Which Puerto Rican?
Pardon?
Which Puerto Rican?
His name was Eugene Rodriguez, and he got into a scuffle with other politicians. He ended up actually serving a prison sentence. He had risen to the New York State Assembly, so he was moving up before the drug business started.
from the late 19th and early 20th century allowed into military service? Was there ever an obstacle? I'm sort of
No,
going full circle.
No, the obstacle was never for them. They were drafted, right, during the selective service, and they are taken. They could become citizens while they were in the service. Some of them had already become citizens. The obstacle to military service was always for African Americans. One evening, a number of years ago, I was having dinner with John Hope Franklin, the great African American historian who was the editor of the series in which my first book appeared. And as the evening wore on and we were talking about things, it was very, very clear that one of the most powerful experiences John Hope had ever had in his life, and one that hurt him deeply, was being rejected at the draft board in the South. He went as a young man to sign up to fight in World War II, and he was turned away with what black men often heard, and this is a white man's war. And so that's where the discrimination really was, not against Irish immigrants. They end up in the service. But the most painful part of the prejudice is that suffered by African Americans. Any other questions? If not, I thank you very much.
Alan, thank you.
Thank you.